And in the mid-1930s, a brilliant young British composer met one of the great violinists of his or any other age. They were William Walton and Jascha Heifetz. Heifetz commissioned Walton's Violin Concerto, gave the premiere, then made the first recording. And in many ways, he's still the yardstick against which any more recent recording has to be measured. In this week's Building a Library, Piers Burton Page goes looking for the finest accounts of the Walton Violin Concerto since this one.
Sognando, literally dreaming, but maybe dreamily would do as well. That's the instruction over the solo violin part at its first immediate entry in this three-movement work, which begins with a slow movement, sort of. The dreamer there was Jascha Heifetz himself, recorded just a couple of years after giving the premiere, and capturing the lazy, slumberous mood of that gorgeous initial melody. But if, opening the score for the first time, Heifetz thought for however brief a moment that he was going to have an easy time of it, the second movement would have quickly caused a change of mind. Presto capriccioso alla napoletana is what stands at the head of Walton's second movement, a scherzo and trio, again, sort of, inspired by the Neapolitan tarantella, the dance induced after being bitten by a tarantula. Walton, staying nearby, claimed that he had been. And so this presto, that was Heifetz again, by the way, from the same recording, starts with a wild virtuoso ride. Double-stopped harmonics, all sorts of pizzicato effects, lightning changes of articulation on and off the string, and all at a ferocious tempo. It's not a work for the faint-hearted. This movement is a litmus test for violinists, and even on record, some famous names acquit themselves less well than lesser-known colleagues. The idea for a violin concerto seems first to have been mooted when Walton and Heifetz met in London in 1936. The intention was that it should be premiered at the World's Fair, to be held in New York in June 1939, though that target would eventually be missed. Walton doesn't actually seem to have begun serious work till 1938, while staying in Italy with his friend Alice Wimborne at the Villa Cimbrone on the coast near Ravello. According to the composer, she'd get cross if he didn't knuckle down to work soon after breakfast. Some of the concerto was tried out in London at the end of that summer, 1938, with the violinist Antonio Brosa, who'd later give the premiere of the Britain Concerto. The date of completion on the manuscript is June 2nd, 1939. So, when Walton went to visit Heifetz in New York just the previous month, the concerto was presumably finished, apart from some details. Here's Heifetz again, one more time, brushing aside imperturbably those dangerous webs woven by the venomous spider. A different recording this time, though. you want Heifetz in the Walton Concerto, and he's the mandatory historical choice, well, you don't have to live with the early 1941 recording with its pretty occluded sound, because Heifetz recorded the work twice. The second time in London in 1950, this time with the composer himself conducting the Philharmonia, and that's what we just heard. It's possible that Walton didn't have much input into the very first performance or recording, no influence over tempi or other matters, because by the time Heifetz gave the premiere in December 1939, Britain was of course at war. So Walton was unable to be present when the Cleveland Orchestra was conducted by Arthur Rodzinski, nor was he present when Heifetz recorded the concerto for the first time 2 years later, now with the Cincinnati Orchestra and Eugene Goossens conducting. It'd be very interesting to know when he first heard Heifetz's recording, because the ship crossing the Atlantic with the copy intended for the composer was torpedoed, and the discs, and indeed the performance materials, were lost. Still, when, in 1950, Heifetz and Walton came together in London to make that second recording, the composer must either have been happy with Heifetz's speeds, or disinclined to disturb a by now fixed idea of how to play it, because in many respects the interpretation is identical. Indeed, I'd say it's an even finer recording than the earlier one, a gramophone classic. So, the question for us is as follows. How true is it now that the only way is Heifetz? In May 1938, when he was in the thick of composition, Walton wrote to his publisher Hubert Foss at Oxford University Press, saying that the concerto seems to be developing in an extremely intimate way, not much show and bravura. I think that must have been before the tarantula bite. That remark, I think, is a key to the work in many ways. Open the score, and you're struck not just by that unfamiliar instruction sognando to the soloist, but by the countless times the word solo appears over lines and phrases in the orchestra. It's almost as if it's chamber music. And I'll lay my cards on the table and say right now that it's the recordings that treat it as such, where both conductor and soloist recognise that fact, that I warm to most. That opening there came from Dong Suk Kang, with Paul Daniel conducting the English Northern Philharmonia. And this time you could hear the bassoon properly, solo, espressivo. Walton was perhaps being disingenuous in his comment to Hubert Foss, because in fact the first movement turns virtuosic not too long after the opening. Indeed, there's a sort of mini cadenza, not quite labelled as such, unusually early on. The build-up to that moment starts with a familiar Walton tick, a sudden, ferocious intrusion from the orchestra. That's from a recentish version, only 6 years old, that's clearly going to be a strong contender. The Canadian violinist James Ennis has a magnificent technique, as we heard, and indeed will hear. Not only that, but he also embraces the intimacy and the poetry of the piece. His accompanists are the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra and their long-standing British-born conductor Bramwell Tovey. Another, even more recent recording from among the 20-odd versions that I have to consider is likewise one that for me captures every aspect of this concerto almost to perfection. And, dare I say it, it comes from an unexpected source. The soloist is Thomas Bowes, with the Orchestra of Malmö Opera in Sweden, playing under their principal conductor Joseph Swenson. And we can spot a few clues there as to why this version is so successful. Joseph Swenson is familiar enough from his 9 years at the helm of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and he played many violin concertos as a soloist before turning to conducting. Also, his orchestra is totally used to listening to singers. Thomas Bowes has chosen an unspectacular route to the top via leading orchestras and spending several years as first violin of the Maggini Quartet. But he yields to no one in terms of sensitivity and technical mastery. You get the feeling that he knows every bar of this concerto inside out. Thomas Bowes, playing, and I think throughout this concerto, surely listening. 6 of our 20 soloists are women, ranging from Kyung-Hwa Chung in 1973 to Akiko Suwanai in 2002. I wish there were more. There was, for instance, a glowing proms performance by Midori within living memory. Let me play you 3 of them now. Ida Hendel recorded the Walton Violin Concerto in 1977. It's a terrific version, at once fiery and impassioned, and lovingly tender. I love the way Ida Hendel often digs deep into the strings to replicate the countless accents and staccatos and other marks of encouragement with which Walton peppers the score. But, as we'll hear in a longer extract this time, she also offers an almost Elgarian nobilmente, not a word Walton actually uses. And she's aided and abetted by conductor Paavo Berglund at the peak of his form during his tenure with the Bournemouth Symphony. Ida Händel, the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, and Paavo Berglund. Her version from 1977 certainly stands the test of time, though overall it's actually one of the slowest, a fact perhaps attributable to the slightly over-resonant acoustic in which it was recorded. The end of the first movement is exquisite. Walton reverts once more to that languid Italianate opening, but this time marks it assai più lento che prima, much slower than at the start. Here's just the very end, the dying fall realised with melting grace and tenderness by another ardent Waltonian, Tasmin Little. Tasmin Little, oddly enough with the same orchestra as Ida Händel, the Bournemouth Symphony, and with another of their principal conductors too, Andrew Litton. This is a version we must obviously come back to. But now we've reached that diabolical slow movement. Here's Walton to his colleague Hubert Foss again. Having been bitten by a tarantula, a rare and dangerous and unpleasant experience, I've celebrated the occasion by the second movement being a kind of tarantella, quite gaga, I may say, and of doubtful propriety after the first movement. This is Lydia Mordkovich's recording. I'm not sure that she's quite gaga enough, certainly compared to Heifetz earlier, and the recording masks the sinister rattle of the snare drum in this extract too. Lydia Mordkovich, with her the London Philharmonic, and Jan Latham Koenig. Relatively early in his career, the late lamented Richard Hickox and the London Symphony Orchestra accompanied the Italian violin virtuoso Salvatore Accardo in this work. It's a worthy but not exceptional version, but let's just hear a snatch of the opening of this movement from Hickox, because typically he's noticed a nice detail, the fact that the winds have an appoggiatura before their accented first note, something many versions skate over. Richard Hickox, making small things audible. Staying with audibility for a moment, at the outset I mentioned the two Heifetz recordings. There is one difference between the earlier and later Heifetz versions, and that is that Walton revised the concerto between them. Before its publication, on the basis of the first British performances by the Danish violinist Henry Holst, who was a former leader of the Berlin Philharmonic under Furtwängler but was now living over here, in November 1943, Walton slimmed down the orchestration, in particular removing a lot of percussion. The differences seem otherwise marginal, with the number of bars remaining the same. You need a good pair of ears to pick out some odd percussion chinks in the second movement in the pre-revision 1941 recording. As far as I know, no one has ever gone back to the original version of the Walton Violin Concerto, but it could be an intriguing and worthwhile exercise, as the revision may just have been a matter of wartime economy. The tarantula movement is actually rather intriguing, because, as we heard, it soon morphs into something quite other, an odd sort of waltz, with smoochy syncopations and parallel sixths for the soloist. Some people play this passage very straight-laced, but others a lot more indulgently. There's a recent 2009 recording from Kurt Nikkanen and the New Haven Symphony Orchestra under William Walton that's perhaps not a recommendable overall version, but the sound and the detail are superb, and I like the freedom with which Kurt Nikkanen treats this moment. A touch of schmaltz, even. Kurt Nikkanen, evoking an alfresco cafe in Naples or Ischia on a hot afternoon in the shade, with a sentimental fiddler hovering near your table. This tarantella movement is actually cast by Walton in a shape resembling a symphonic scherzo, and sure enough, in the middle it has a section labelled trio, and then in brackets, canzonetta. The first horn has a prominent solo. Walton himself lavished high praise on the 1973 recording made by Kyung-Wha Chung with the London Symphony Orchestra under that noted Walton exponent Andre Previn. Alas, it all feels a little grainy these days, and the horn solo is tubby and distant. Kyung-Wha Chung, the LSO, and Andre Previn. And now, without more ado, the same canzonetta again, this time from James Ennis and his Canadian forces, and we'll run on just a little further this time. James Ennis and colleagues, much more acceptable in every respect, I think. Almost all the booklet notes say that this canzonetta in the second movement is based on a Neapolitan folk song. Well, part of me wonders if that's right. If so, I've certainly never seen it identified anywhere. On the other hand, it may well be true, and if so, then I'll bet it's a love song, a coded reference to Walton's lover at the time, Alice Wimborne. You can almost tell as much from the way the motif is now exquisitely developed, the soloist embellishing it by singing away in his or her topmost register, and duetting with a number of members of the orchestra, the harp especially. Again, I want intimacy, a conductor with an ear for the tricky balance, and a poet to capture the magic of this moment. Thomas Bowes certainly qualifies. Thomas Bowes, the Malmo Opera Orchestra, and Joseph Swenson conducting. Blink and you might miss it, but the last couple of pages of the second movement are a compositional tour de force, in which Walton combines echoes of all three themes, the tarantella, that smoky waltz, and the folk song, and, for good measure, then almost throws them away dismissively. That was Tasmin Little again, with Andrew Litton conducting the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, deftly turning the end of Walton's Neapolitan Caprice. So we've reached the finale, but we're by no means done yet, because it's much the longest of Walton's three movements, with a wealth of different episodes. So let's just briefly take stock. Among the versions on the list, which I'm setting to one side without even letting you hear them, are two more conducted by the composer himself. A powerful live recording from a tour of New Zealand with a fine American soloist called Burl Senofsky, and the studio recording with Menuhin from 1970, not his finest studio appearance. One thing common to all the composer's versions is the way he positively tears into the few orchestral tuttis that there are, treating them deliberately as rude interruptions into the soloist's discourse. At his hands they have something of the malice so prevalent in his First Symphony of just a few years earlier. That's presumably an effect he intended, so it's presumably an effect other versions ought to try to achieve too. Then Joshua Bell's 1996 recording somehow never quite seems to catch fire for me, while Zeno Francescatti's account with Ormandy in the Philadelphia, the first after Heifetz, stands up well by way of fire and incisiveness, but is sonically rather harsh. Aaron Rosand and the Florida Philharmonic, under a British conductor, James Judd, often feel a trifle laboured, even here at the start of the finale, which starts deceptively with a kind of gawky march. Aaron Rosand, the Florida Philharmonic, and James Judd, in their version from 1991. On the basis of what we've heard already, and what we'll hear in this finale, I'd say that there are really just 4 contenders left in the ring, including one I've not mentioned yet, Nigel Kennedy. The others are Thomas Bowes, James Ennis, and Tasmin Little. I called the finale's opening gesture deceptive just now because it's the prelude to one of the Walton Violin Concerto's crowning glories. The march morphs into a new and extended tune announced by the soloist, which, well, actually, I don't think I'm even going to try and describe it. I'll let Tasmin Little do the talking for me. Phrasing, dynamics, rubato, all the little accents and portamenti perfectly in place. That was Tasmin Little with the Bournemouth Orchestra, beautifully guided there by Andrew Litton. Now then, to Nigel Kennedy. You don't need me to tell you that he really can play the violin properly, and that on CD the playing comes unencumbered with the usual Kennedy antics. He recorded the concerto in 1987. It's a beautifully detailed studio recording, and a performance every bit the equal of the best of those that we've been considering. Fizzing with life, gutsy, passionate, and very intense. But one bar in this finale wrecks it for me, and I don't think I could keep listening to it. There's a beautiful passage where the soloist is accompanied by whispering or burbling winds. At the end, Walton marks a portamento for the soloist into the next section, but he surely can't have meant it to sound the way Nigel Kennedy chooses. Nigel Kennedy, undermining himself with an ill-considered daub of vulgarity. On grounds I mentioned earlier, which is to say the intended rude impact of the aggressive orchestral tuttis, and combined with a slightly distant and echoey recording that several times left me straining to hear vital orchestral details, I'm in the end also going to rule out the fine version by James Ennis, but not without letting you hear a final extract, to demonstrate all the same that James Ennis has the full measure of this concerto's subtlety and delicacy. James Ennis, with Bramwell Tovey conducting the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. So it's down to a choice between Thomas Bowes, sensitive, refined, thoughtful, elegant, as well as brilliant, even flamboyant when Walton's Heifetz-inspired solo part demands it, ready to live dangerously, in fact. And Tasmin Little? Ditto. Truth to tell, they're impossible to separate. I'd be happy with either. First, here's Thomas Bowes in part of the long rhapsodic cadenza, some of which is gently accompanied by the orchestra, a lift from, and surely a homage to, Elgar's great earlier example. Thomas Bowes. This isn't a heartrending or a tragic work. All the same, it's often deeply moving, and nowhere more so than in that spellbinding cadenza at the hands of Thomas Bowes. And with that cadenza, it is indeed as if Walton has somehow shot his bolt. For the first and only time, the last couple of pages of the concerto feel perfunctory, even conventional, the pretext for just a few final showcase fireworks. Much better for us, I think, to end where we started, with the lyrical beginning of the whole work, as played by Tasmin Little. I think that she has the complete measure of the piece in all its varied moods, and in the accompaniment under Andrew Litton, every gesture is beautifully wrought, as well as impeccably recorded too. So Walton's opening instruction is most poetically realised. Sognando, dreaming.
Tasmin Little and the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra conducted by Andrew Litton in the Walton Violin Concerto, and their Decca recording is Piers Burton Page's overall Building a Library recommendation, currently available as a digital download. You can hear the complete performance on Monday morning in Radio 3's Essential Classics, so make sure you're listening from 11 a.m. if you want to hear all of it. Well, let's assume, as Piers suggested, that you'll want a historic Heifetz recording in one form or another, and if you need a more recent single CD recommendation, Piers would suggest Thomas Bowes with the Malmö Opera Orchestra conducted by Joseph Svensson, which you'll find on Signum Classics. Well, details of the recommended recordings are on the CD Review website, from where you can also subscribe to our Building a Library podcast to listen to at your leisure every week.